My name is Charlie Pepitone. I teach in the theater and dance department. Hi, Josh. And I directed the show at Wayland Baptist University last March.
Go Pioneers.
Go Pioneers. Wow. There you go. We performed there. We performed down in Lubbock, and then I thought it would be great to bring these guys up, start the season with it. So they've been in our classes all week working with students, and it's just been a real treat to have them around. I'm particularly really happy about this. Marty was my mentor and undergraduate professor in theater there at Wayland. And Corey and I went to school together there at Wayland, so it was a giant reunion. Great.
I'm Corey Norman. Played C.S. Lewis.
Serious?
Yeah, I'm serious. Okay, I do graduate admissions and recruitment at Texas Tech University. And before that was the managing director of Theater 3 in Dallas, Texas. So I'm really glad to be here. This has been a terrific experience all week in Spokane.
Marty Reynolds, Dean of Fine Arts at Wayland, Director of Theater. And yes, it's an honor to work with these guys. It's great.
I'm David Calhoun in the philosophy department here, and I direct the Gonzaga Socratic Club, which is co-sponsoring tonight's discussion.
Tim Clancy. I'm a Jesuit priest, and I teach philosophy of religion in terms of what's relevant to this. I run the honors program here and pastor of a small parish outside of town.
And I'm Brian Clayton. I'm also in the philosophy department. I'm also director of the Faith and Reason Institute. I normally teach a course on C.S. Lewis in the fall semester, but I'm on sabbatical this semester. So I'll teach 2 sections of it next spring.
Would you like to start?
Yeah, I thought it might be helpful if I can call on Dr. Clayton to start. The key part of the argument that C.S. Lewis makes in the production is what's fairly well known as the trilemma argument. So maybe Dr. Clayton can sketch that out as a basic part of the argument that's being used.
Right. So the way the argument goes is he's either liar, lunatic, or Lord. And of course, as was alluded to in the play, that sort of version of the argument is too simple. In that, for example, maybe he never made the claim to be Lord, right? And so that's why the reference to Weldon is particularly significant, because he seems to take seriously that this was a claim that was made. And so at one point I tried working out, covering as many possibilities as I could. And I think I wound up with an argument with about, I don't know, 27 steps, something like that, which doesn't work nearly as well as an argument with like 3 or 4 steps, which is what Lewis did. And of course, Lewis was addressing himself to a popular audience. The trilemma shows up in Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity originally consisted of a series of radio addresses he gave on the BBC during the Second World War. And I can't remember if it's in book 1 or I think it's in book 2 of Mere Christianity. And there he says, what I'm trying to do is to prevent somebody from saying something really foolish like he was a great moral teacher. He says, that's not an option that's open to you. And that's when he then presents the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma. So that's basically what the argument is.
Charlie, what do you think if we didn't plan this ahead, if you can't tell that. So this is extemporaneous. We've had a wonderful presentation of a rehearsed play, and now this is completely unrehearsed. So we might just, I don't know, if to keep this brief, maybe if each of us just maybe has a couple of sentence comment, and again, since you gave us a reconstruction of an argument, I'll let you start with something you observed from the play, an idea that you note is particularly significant.
I was talking with Charlie and the actors after up here, and it was near the end of the play. where Lewis says, my idea of God, it constantly changes. He shatters it time and time again. Still, I feel the world is crowded with him. He is everywhere incognito, and his incognito is so hard to penetrate. This idea of his idea of God being shattered, if you've read A Grief Observed, which was a diary that he kept after the death of his wife, Joy. Joy died in 1959, I believe, and then Grief Observed was published a year or two after that. And one of the images he uses there is of God as the great iconoclast, that we're constantly setting up images of God, and in that way we're limiting God, and that what God has to do with those images is to shatter them over and over again. We think we've got God pinned down, we've got God in a box. The end of that passage reads, the real struggle is to keep trying, to come awake, then stay awake. And when I read that again today, what struck me, it seemed to me that the playwright was drawing off of the scene in Prince Caspian, where Lucy wakes up in the middle of the night. The trees are all dead because the Telmarines have been, spoiler alert. But the Telmarines have been chopping down trees, so the spirits of the trees are all dead. They're awaiting the return of Aslan to Narnia to awaken again, for him to awaken them. But she wakes up in the middle of the night, and she gets up and she begins to wander through the trees, and it's almost, she can hear them almost coming alive again, the spirits coming alive again. And then it's like, she says it's something like, either you came too early or just a moment too late, but you just missed it. And so that struggle to come alive and to stay alive, I think, is an image that's in Prince Caspian and other places. And I thought it was fascinating that the playwright picked up on that. I think that's where it came from, and included that in that passage about the hiddenness of God and God as the great iconoclast.
Well, what I'd like to talk about just for a second is Freud and C.S. Lewis wrangling over the problem of evil, and they frame it in the traditional way, that evil counts against the existence of God, and how can there be a good God with all this evil in the world? I've become pretty convinced that that is a poor way of framing the problem. Because I don't think Christianity is about justifying evil. I think Christianity is about redeeming evil. And to redeem evil isn't necessarily to justify it, it's to exercise it. And so the problem, and I'm getting this from Marilyn McCord Adams, is that what Christianity is about isn't about protecting us from evil. It's not about avoiding evil. It's about finding meaning in evil. Evil is this onslaught of meaninglessness. It threatens our identity. It threatens to turn our life into a bad joke. That's, I think, the demonic quality of evil, not the pain, but the attack on the meaningfulness and the dignity of my existence. And so, can one find the sacred, or can the sacred survive in the teeth of that onslaught? And Christianity actually gives you resources. People find just beholding the crucifix is there's this guy dying on the cross, potentially in despair. I mean, he says, my God, why have you abandoned me? That sounds like despair. Could also be the quotation from think it's the 22nd Psalm, in which case he's affirming his faith in the teeth of its repudiation. So maybe it's hoping despite himself that there's a God. But when I'm suffering, when I'm confronted with evil, one way to hold on to the meaningfulness of my life is to contemplate that crucifix and to be present, and in being present to Christ's suffering, to remind myself that he's present in my suffering. So I think, I don't think psychologically and historically that evil makes people less religious. I think suffering evil makes people more religious, because religion gives you resources for dealing with meaninglessness. Religious ritual, funerals, rosaries, all this stuff is about helping us to bear with unbearable feelings. And now, oftentimes the meaning that we find in the suffering is only in retrospect, just as the meaning of the crucifixion is only found in retrospect and the resurrection. But in the teeth of that experience of evil, I can try to maintain the faith that it's not, or that God loves me, not God loves who I could have been, or that God loves who I should have been, but that God loves me, the person who has been shaped by this experience of evil. And so, in retrospect, would I wish it hadn't happened? I don't know. Would I wish that I wasn't myself, but that I was some other person that never had to deal with this, but then wouldn't be the person I am now? I think to truly accept myself, I say, or put it this way, I had a friend of mine who took like 9 years to die of bone cancer. And at the end, she said, you know, this is an evil, this is a terrible thing, but it's not like I wish it hadn't happened, because it's made me who I am. I wouldn't be me without this fight against cancer. So, and Marilyn McCord-Adams says, that's the beatific vision, is God loving that person. Not the person I could have been, not the person I would have been if this affliction had never occurred. So even though in the teeth of the affliction, it can be an experience of annihilation and meaninglessness, like Freud talking about his kids. In retrospect, the evil can be redeemed. And it's redeemed not because in retrospect I can see how this is a tool that means it's actually better than I did, but it's made me who I am, and I have a meaningful life. You know? So it's not like everybody should go through this evil. It's like, that's who I am. So I think what I want to do with this notion of redemption is that it gives meaning to evil without making evil a means to justifying, without making evil justified by the goal. The end doesn't justify the means. Even if it's God, he should not use evil to accomplish good things. But in evil, in retrospect, I've become who I am. And if I like who I am, I can't say I wish it hadn't happened. So my question to the atheist is, how do you redeem evil? How do you keep faith and meaning when all seems lost? You don't have religious ritual to rely on. Well, what do you rely on? What are the rituals that keep your life going? And to me, that's anonymous religion.
I appreciate the fact that the play poses the question. I think this is directly connected to Tim's comment, that the play poses the modern question, are we alone in the cosmos? In fact, that's one thing that Freud says specifically. He asked that question about whether we're alone or whether we can face being alone in the cosmos. And of course, both the Freud character and the Lewis character in the play toy with the idea that it's a choice, but both of them know that it's not merely a choice, that instead we appeal to relevant evidence, that we look at the way the world is, and included in that is the experience of evil, which drives us in some cases away from an answer, or drives us to the answer that we are alone, and in some cases, as Tim has already indicated, it drives us in the direction of seeing that God is present even in the midst of suffering and challenge and evil. And so I appreciate, as I say, that that's the question the film asks, and it shows us how we do grapple with the evidence that might push us in either direction. And I think it helpfully warns us that we often, in our subjectivist, relativist culture, we often think it is just a matter of I get to choose one or the other. It isn't that facile, it isn't that simple, but instead it has to do with how we encounter the world as either empty and answering our prayers and our cries with silence, or in the alternative that we hear the world answering our pain and our cries with hope and with grace. Marty?
You know, I think one way to look at the play is to think about it as this external struggle between two men, but another way to look at it is to think about this struggle that exists within each of us. And not to suggest, perhaps, that each of us is this dialectic that's equally divided between faith and reason, or between the mystic and the agnostic or the atheist or whatever. But it is to say, I think, that if we're honest with ourselves, we've had times of doubt, we've had times where we would prefer to take a rational path, we've had times when we question the mystical side, or if you're on the other, maybe if you lean the other way, you've questioned how does rationality answer this sort of issue, you know, where's the way forward? And so I think one of the things that happens, talking about the choices that you're talking about, is I think one of the things the play sort of gets at is that we're continually making these choices toward life, or toward mysticism, or toward faith, and that it's not well, I did it on this day, I've done that, I'm good to go, but it's the idea that we're continually facing, you know, this world that you were talking about, this imperfect universe, and that in the midst of all of that struggle, we've got choices to make, and we've got dialectic forces that are opposing each other, and that internal struggle gets represented, I think, by these two men who appear to be battling each other, but in some sense, I really think they're also battling, there's a big battle going on between themselves.
You know, with this play, with me, I was struck just by the beauty of the coming together at the end. That regardless of what each man believed, in the end, they were each a man that cared for the other. And I think that is what
I get from the play the most, really. It's got a lot of stuff to it, but that's what really sticks with me.
It was interesting, when I started working on this play, I was also working on Book of Hours, which was a show last spring, which is based on Rilke's poetry. And so my head was full of Freud and Lewis and Rilke. So it was a heavy set of months. And so when I started looking at the script, I started thinking, these guys are they're just playing to a stalemate. What's the point? And so I kept digging, trying to figure out what is the playwright up to? What's actually going on? And so since theater is the intersection of the script and the time that you produce the play and then the artist working on it, what really caught my attention was a line in Rilke, which is the director's note that's in there, where he calls God, he uses the metaphor, the song we sang in every silence, you dark net threading through us. And there are so many of those silences in this play where you see both of them leaning into this silence, yearning for something to draw them together. There are so many points of connection that is that dark net that threads these two polar opposites together, that while they're playing a game that has no end, essentially, that dark net threads them together. And I think that's what the playwright is trying to do. It's a play about monsters that we deal with in those silences, and it's in those moments that dark net threads them together. And that's what I think that makes this play that genius. He sets these two brilliant minds together, and then he lets those silences, those monsters, really flesh out what he's doing.
And both Lewis and Freud talked about something like that. I mean, there's a reference in the play to Sehnsucht, the sense of longing that actually is very important to Lewis in his concept of joy. But even Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, talks about this oceanic sense that he relates it to the mystic you were talking about earlier, this sense that we sometimes have of being connected to something deeper, richer, than beyond our individual selves. And of course, what Freud suggests, in line with his answer that we're alone in the cosmos, is it's an illusion, it's a mistake. But I like how you're drawing out that I think we can see that even if I can use a fancy philosophical word here, phenomenologically, in his own experience, Freud's aware of this sense of connection, and he has really, in a blunt way, he has a different theory for what it is than, say, Lewis does, or in your example, than Rilke does.
I think Freud in this play is at a bit of a disadvantage because Lewis is arguing for what he believes in, and Freud is arguing for what he doesn't believe in. And it would be more powerful if Freud were to be arguing for what he does believe in, so that you have two positives rather than a positive and a negative battling it out. And I think what Freud does believe in is that life's a tragedy. He has a very tragic view of life, but a tragic view of life is not a meaningless view of life. Tragedy is, for Kant anyway, sublime. It's the affirmation of value in the teeth of meaninglessness. And I think that's his, so when Lewis calls him a coward, that's like the most distorted epithet you could possibly give to Freud. Freud saw himself as a hero, and he didn't think religion gave people neuroses. He thought religion saved people from neuroses. It gave them illusions that protected them from seeing reality face to face, because he thought very few people have the courage to face the truth. We need to live in illusions. But he wouldn't live in an illusion. So, I mean, that's what he believes in. He believes in science. He believes in the human tragedy not being a cruel joke, even if there isn't objective meaningfulness. It doesn't invalidate the meaningfulness of human life. But in the play, we just hear what he doesn't believe in. And I think that's always the problem with atheists. We're defining them by what they don't believe in. We're not talking about, well, C.S. Lewis versus a humanist, where one person believes in humanity, the other person believes in God. It's like one person believes in God, one person doesn't believe in God. They're not coming from the same, they don't have this. Yeah.
I totally agree with what you're saying, but I do think there is a playing field where they are on the same page, and that's their ego.
Fair enough.
They both know they're right. They're 100% sure that they're right. And I think part of the beauty of the play is that what Charlie was talking about, these monsters that they face, it's the monsters and their willingness to see the vulnerability of the monster in the other. Oh yeah, I have monsters. Oh yeah, I have vulnerability. There's another human in the room. Maybe it isn't all about being right and wrong. Maybe it's about there's another person sitting across from me that I can share an experience with.
Questions, comments? I can barely see, so you'll, yeah.
I think it's interesting though when they do try to, the one moment in the play where I can think that they do try to both give positive views and not what they don't believe in is the moment where Freud says, you believe in revelation and I believe in science. Like if we're going to talk about this, we have no common language. And that to me, I read Kuhn this summer, and so it makes me think of like paradigms and how each of us has a conceptual framework through which we see the world. Mm-hmm. And in the worst case, if your conceptual framework isn't the same as somebody else's, you can't have a conversation with them. And that's something that, Alvin Plantinga and Thomas Nagel have talked about. Like, it's not so much that the evidence strikes the Christian such that she believes in God, and the evidence strikes the atheist such that she doesn't believe in God. It's that they have prior commitments to either theism or atheism, and those prior commitments inform the way they interpret the evidence in the first place. And so that idea of putting Freud and Lewis in a room where they're both presenting positive arguments rather than negative ones is kind of interesting, because I wonder if we would run into that problem where it's just like we don't speak the same language. And so just thoughts, if you agree with something more fundamental.
Notice it's critical to the play that Freud sees an affinity with Lewis because until very recently he saw the cosmos in the same way that Freud now does. And so it seems to me that may be another point at which Lewis is at an advantage, an unfair advantage, because he has he's in a sense experienced both of those ways of looking at the world. And that gives him a ground, not only a ground of commonality, at least with Freud, but it gives him, you could even say, a kind of transcending stance toward both of the stances that we can take on this issue. I think it undermines that idea, as I said. I think it's really important that the play reminds us that we often think this is just a choice. And Lewis, when he's asked where the Freud character says, oh, so you just decided to believe and the birds sang in the trees and everything was hunky-dory. And Lewis says, no, I chose to look at the evidence. In a way, he's saying, I chose to shatter, again, this is very similar to what Dr. Clayton said at the beginning, I chose to allow my framework to be shattered by looking at evidence and trying to allow myself to see it in a new and fresh way.
But Lewis is talking like a reformed alcoholic. He is presenting his previous self as lost and blind, and now I see. Right? So he's in the new paradigm in which the old paradigm seems lost and blind. I mean, it's like he's, so I'm not sure, yeah. So I guess he's very cynical about the old paradigm because he's not in it anymore.
But he carries the rationality forward. I mean, he's not talking to us about relationships. He's not talking with us about divine experience. It's almost kind of like, well, you know, I was in this, you know, thing with my brother, and I just figured it out. Well, if this syllogism, you know, well then that has to be it. And Lewis in the play, Lewis is, you know, young. And when we get Mere Christianity in these earlier writings, we get more apologetics. But as Lewis gets older and as you speak, you know, loses joy, his wife, and then his theology starts to, it's not so black and white anymore. Now we've got some, how do I deal with this loss? Where's God fit into this? And it becomes a little bit less 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it starts to permeate out a little in different kinds of ways, which I think is one of the reasons that Lewis is such a great figure for a lot of folks in religious circles.
Yeah. Somebody over here had a hand up? Yes.
One line early in the play that I heard Freud give was, God created everything. Did God create evil? And I think that posed a good question, but it kind of went too fast for me.
Sometimes I get too fast.
Well, that's the problem, the heart of the problem of evil. If God is sovereign and God is the ultimate causal agent responsible for the entirety of the cosmos, then that means every feature and dimension of the cosmos is due in some way to God. Of course, the Lewis character partially diffuses that problem by noting that what philosophers call human evils as opposed to natural evils are our responsibility. We act toward one another with cruelty. We do violence to one another, and that at least addresses part of evil and suffering in the world. But remember, Freud's response to that is, so what about my cancer, right? What about, and then as Tim pointed out, he runs through the litany of his daughter and his grandchild, who both suffered as a result of natural evils, not things that people did, but they died from disease. And so a theistic account, I mean, this goes to the question, this actually goes to the comment that Tim made about whether evil can be justified, right? A traditional approach to the problem of evil in philosophy of religion, in Christian philosophy of religion, is to try to offer accounts. What are ways that we could make sense of why God would allow evil to take place? And those approaches or those attempts are called theodicies, attempts to justify the ways of God to human beings. But it's certainly the case that the play leaves the resolution of that issue hanging. And I think it is interesting that, in a way, solidarity becomes the answer to that. As you said at the end, when Lewis is consoling and caring for Freud, and when he has this violent attack due to the prosthesis. Now, is that an answer? Does that say, oh, it's okay now, God created evil, or God allowed evil to occur, is the more traditional way to put it. But still, most of us are going to say, that's not quite a satisfying answer, right? Instead, what we have to do is look for other resources, as Tim suggested.
And the short answer is God didn't create evil because evil is nothing. And I think the profound answer is God didn't create evil because evil is meaningless. And evil, I love Hannah Arendt who says that, and I thought of this when they were talking about Lucifer. I said, evil is not glamorous. Evil is banal. Evil is meaningless. Right? And we can be in a lot of pain, but that's not what's really hard about suffering evil. It's the threat that my life is a joke, and the pain is convincing me of that. I mean, that's what has to be battled, I think.
Yeah. Just two brief points. One is that the fact that Freud was dealing with cancer would have made a big impact. I mean, if Lewis had actually met Freud, because the first great loss he suffered in his life was his mother's death, cancer. The second great loss was his father, cancer. The third great loss was his wife, cancer. So this is so he had been dealing with this all of his life. And his early response to this was to offer a kind of theodicy in the problem of pain. He does attempt to set out sort of a traditional defense of God, here what God's reasons are. But when you get to Grief Observed, which he writes after the death of his wife, there's a rational component, but he's not really giving a theodicy at that point. It's at that point that he introduces this notion of the great iconoclast. I thought I had God figured out. Here's why God's doing what God's doing. No, God shatters that, right? And yet, the line, again, beautiful in the play, still, I feel the world is crowded with him. The sense that God is still present, even though I can't put God in a box, right? And I just kind of occasionally wake up to the presence of God, and the tough thing is to stay alive, or stay awake.
Which incidentally is the answer to the question, are we alone in the cosmos? And the answer is no. I see the universe is crowded with God, or infused with grace, to use theological language.
Or I'd say keep the faith. Simone Weil, in her article on affliction, says, keep the faith. Even if it's the nail in the hand.
So, at one point when Lewis is looking at the idols, or the statuettes right over there on there, I found it interesting that he picked out Eros, Cupid over there, which later on in Lewis's life, after he had met Joy, they actually worked together to write the book Until We Have Faces. You know, all that questioning about the sister of the wife of Cupid, did she meet this God, and this relationship, and how God and how the divine relates to us. And and he wrote that book with Joy before the Grief Observed. And I was just wondering if any of you guys, if you guys knew about that book at all, if you saw hints of that as well, because that was the only time that I saw that book, and I felt like it was very blatant. So I was wondering if you saw anything else within the play that was relating to that particular book and piece of.
That gives me a chance to make a plug. Lewis is a Christian Platonist, and so his attraction to the concept of Eros and the reality of Eros is that Eros is a drive that points us beyond itself. So it's related to his argument from desire, right? Desire is connected to Eros, which he talks about in a number of books, in The Four Loves, and certainly in Pilgrim's Regress, and in Mere Christianity, and also in Till We Have Faces. But I mentioned that he was a Christian Platonist because the fourth Socratic Club meeting of this semester in December, I'm very pleased to say that our own Dr. Danielle Lane from the philosophy department is going to be talking about the meaning of Christian Platonism. And it's an outlook, certainly. It's not surprising that Mark St. Germain, the playwright, would have Lewis notice and pick up the Eros character, because Eros is central to that idea that human longing and striving draws us into relationship, but the Christian Platonist, like Lewis, wants to argue that it always points beyond itself. Human relationships are a wonderful thing, they're a good thing. As he says, that love, Eros, is a God-given reality, but his ultimate view is that Eros is a drive that points us beyond ourselves and even beyond this world. So I've made my plug. Anybody else have a...
No, I was just going to say the same thing. I noticed, it struck me as well. And I do, when I teach the Lewis course, the last book that we read is Till We Have Faces. And we're paying attention to the role of Eros. We began by talking about Plato's Symposium, and philosophy as an erotic activity, etc. And that fits in, as Dr. Calhoun indicated, with Lewis's argument in Surprised by Joy, and elsewhere, about this desire, this eros, right, that we have, this love that we have, and where it's really pointing. So, yes?
So as a quick follow-up question then, with Freud's response to that, again, it was very fast. It was very, very good memorizing there with the lines and stuff. It was very snappy. It was very good. All I heard was that his only point to argue against the choice of Eros and all that love was just brush aside Lewis's ideals as just simply romantic. Would you say that that's the what I mean, you guys make you argue if that was the epitome of what Freud felt?
I don't know.
It was just romantic.
I don't know how Marty's playing that. I took that line as not brushing it aside. He said, "You're a romantic," and I thought, as a romantic, I thought, wow, he's right. Lewis, in that moment, Lewis was the romantic. So I didn't see that as a smack aside. It was a realization.
Yeah, I nod with that.
Interestingly enough, I'm sure Tim could say more about this, but Freud, this is an aspect of their views on which Freud and Lewis, as a Christian Platonist, are much closer than we might think, because Freud contrasts Eros and Thanatos. Eros is the drive to bind together, and he certainly doesn't think that Eros brings us to God, but he does think that Eros is the force that, as he says at one point, everything is sexual. He's really talking there about Eros. And Eros is what drives us to do everything we do. And in his theory of sublimation, he would argue that all human pursuits are driven by Eros. So in a way, Freud's a Platonist too, a kind of a Platonist.
I mean, aren't people with a tragic view of life, aren't they romantic? I think Freud is a romantic. He's translating romanticism into scientific medical language. So he's kind of medicalizing romanticism because he thinks that if it's going to be true, it has to be scientific. But you're right, he's drawing on German idealism, he's drawing on German romanticism, he's drawing on German mysticism even. Not necessarily always consciously, but yeah, no, I think he is in that tradition, which is probably why I like him, because I'm a romantic for sure.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I wanted to just make a couple comments how I enjoyed the performance, and the energy between the two of you was delicious and heartfelt, and it was a real magic carpet for us all. Your comments on the silence caused me to reflect on the volleys between the two of you, your dialogues, like waves. And I found my own tenderness, well, my own certitude dissolving in those silences where I would wait for a response. And that fragility then, and that tenderness would come into me, and I would realize my own vulnerability in that way. But, so that when Lewis shows compassion towards Freud at the end, for me was the reconciliation and the ability of one brother to embrace another in the emptiness and the question. Oh, I kept waiting for the dog to bark. I was hoping Freud's old friend Jung would come. And then maybe after that, Woody Allen.
Yes.
I wanted to follow up on that. I was very curious. One of the first questions asked, and we talked about sort of the dialectic happening between these two characters. The focus of this play is let's pit two minds against each other and see what pops out. And it can kind of attract an audience mentality of who's going to win at the end. But as opposed to sort of a debate between Ken Ham and a mind like Bill Nye, where we can listen for hours and not know the people, but perhaps come up with different ideas. As actors, you approach these characters differently, whereas in an English class, we might know Freud by the ego, id, or maybe just daddy issues. You get to embody him on stage, and you're making choices and thoughts that we don't get to hear. We get to just see the expression. I'm curious if you would share, and of course echo with the actual people through their teachings, but how did you, I don't really know the words to describe it, translate, bring, whatever you feel comfortable with, these characters on stage? Like, how did you approach them or meet them?
Go ahead. That's kind of a difficult question, actually. I'll be honest. When we started reading the script before we ever started rehearsals, we had a few Skype meetings, the three of us. I knew of C.S. Lewis. I'm not a reader of C.S. Lewis. I've been in another play about C.S. Lewis, Shadowlands, and that's, that probably made up maybe 75% of what I knew about C.S. Lewis, to be honest. So, we did some research. I mean, you look him up, you read about him, and whatnot. For me as an actor, I take that with me, but then I listen to the way the playwright wrote the script. I find the moments in the script and draw on my personal experience, draw on what I think, who I think this character, C.S. Lewis, is, and how would he embrace and embody that experience. So it might be, disappointing or whatever, but that's kind of how I came at it.
Could you point, or maybe if you feel comfortable, share a moment where you saw the character in it? Or that, you said, I forget the way you phrased it.
There's several. We'll go back to the looking at the statues. I found it kind of humorous, actually, that he would pick out the Eros, because this, is a guy who was a bachelor, he was kind of a concerned bachelor, beer drinking kind of guy, hanging out with the guys, and to pick out Eros and then be called a romantic, which I didn't really think he was, just from my reading of it, I thought was kind of humorous. And so, and I think, and to me, playing that, I think there's a bit of being kind of flustered by that, with him. I think, I'll shorten it right there.
When I'm playing someone, I can't play anybody except myself. So that's the first thing. you have to understand is that even though in a reading I may say to myself, well, I've got nothing in common with this guy. I'm not an atheist. I'm a happy guy. I love my wife, you know. And so when you look at this on the surface, it looks like, well, how do I even, you know, dive into this? Then you find things within yourself that you draw from. And you know, one of the things in here is ego, and you know, all of us have moments where we really like to be right. I've certainly had times in my life when I'd like to be right. So I can draw on that. I can draw on pain from the past, suffering from the past. I'm very healthy. I've got to become this guy who's got cancer and this guy who's getting ready to kill himself, which he actually does, you know, just a few weeks after these moments in the play. And so you find, you know, we're all vulnerable. I was speaking about that earlier. We all have monsters. So I try and find things that are inside of me that I can let loose, and that's how I approach it.
One of the things I noticed about this play is that I think Mark St. Germain is more of a Lewis fan than a Freud fan. And I think there's lots of little hints in the script, and so one of our first conversations, I said something along the lines of, I really like Freud better than Lewis. Let's save him, you know? Let's do something to undermine the playwrights tipping the board a little bit. So there are things that I tried to do as a director to try to get the audience to identify more with Freud, and lots of little things like that, where we're advocating. Essentially, all actors are doing is trying to advocate for their characters. No such thing as a villain when you're an actor. You're just, you know, Hannibal Lecter wasn't a villain, he was just hungry. So we did a lot of that. A lot of like, oh, come on, Freud, he's not a bad guy. He's just... So I tried to push back against the playwright a little bit in that regard.
Charlie, can you share some of the specifics along that lines of how you work to tip the scale a bit?
Yeah. Well, in the script, the clearest example of the playwright tipping his hand is in the script. Freud turns the music up, the lights fall. Well, that's a little, come on. It's such a great play to end with such a on-the-nose thing for him to turn the music up. And so you notice in the play, he turned the music up, he turned the music down, and then looked over his office. Nothing has changed. And so that was really intentional. There were several moments like that where I tried to push back against what...
I was really worried. I was really worried when he turned the music up. That was going to be it.
Yeah.
But then when he turned it back off, I thought, that's right. That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that decision.
So there's a handful of those sort of things that just, you know, this playwright is brilliant, but there are several things where he betrays himself.
Well, it's getting a bit late. Let's thank especially our